All right, welcome to Q&A number 9. Now you might notice, if you're paying a lot of attention, hey, there's a lot of questions crossed out that I didn't actually answer. That's because I'm recording this intro, I'm redoing the intro to this video, the Q&A number 9, after actually going all the way through, specifically because of this second question. What actually happened was, I remembered while I was talking through the answer to this question, that there were some interviews done by Blau with EndlessPillows, Yone's designer, and I decided after I watched this video that I would actually, or sorry, after I made my Q&A video, I'd actually go watch the interview since I'd never actually watched it before. I went and I watched it and I realized, oh wait, they reminded me of a bunch of stuff about Yone's old kit that I had forgotten about. So I'm actually going to talk about that. And as for this first question that I answered in the original version of number 9, before I cut back to the original version of the video, short answer is no, it was not a design choice for Storm Surge damage to pop sleep. I actually didn't even realize that it did that. I'm the person who made Storm Surge, so I'm probably going to run this by a few other designers, make sure they think it's reasonable, and I'll probably just, like, at some point, hopefully just make it so it doesn't, because it seems like it's totally reasonable. But yeah, let's talk about Yone. So first of all, for context, there's 3 separate interviews. I'm going to link them in the description of this video that Blau did with EndlessPillows, and they cover a lot of, like, most of the versions of the kit, to be honest. And so if you want a comprehensive read or like understanding of like what did Yone's kit look like, I guess I don't cover literally everything, but the general sort of timeline of Yone's kit, here's how it went. EndlessPillows made this original concept of, hey, Yone, because he's a very, the terminology that you would use for Magic would be top-down designer. Different champ designers have different processes, and they talk actually about this a little bit in the video, but both EndlessPillows and August tend to design to a specific character fantasy. They say, this is Senna, for example. This is Lucian's dead wife, and I'm going to design a thematic version of like what this character looks like. She is a 80 carry support and she has a railgun, right? Like that was his thematic pitch for Senna. Or this is Zeri. She's the fastest 80 carry alive, right? Stuff like that, right? They come up with these very heavily themed pitches, and then they design the gameplay around that. And they actually talk about how not every champ designer worked like this. Like Jag, as an example from the past, is a very mechanics first designer, right? He says, okay, this character has hookshot, and it's Camille, right? And that's the design that comes from that, and the thematic comes later. But the origin of this was EndlessPillows basically saying, I want to do Yone. It is funny in the interviews, he talks about how, Yasuo could be his whole own class. By the time he started making Yone, that had kind of already been proven to be true, that Skirmisher was basically, if not its own class, but its own subclass, right? Which Yasuo isn't even the first one of, right? Like, I would say Riven is actually the first example. But basically this idea of a high repeatability, low range squishy melee character who is very dangerous to be near, but has to pass some sort of skill check in order to kill people, right? Like with Yasuo, this is often knocking them up. With Riven, it's often getting to the target, right? With Aurelia, it's hitting her E or R or both, and so on and so forth, right? These champions tend to have a lot of combat variance, but they're melee, they're squishy. When you make mistakes, you often die, that kind of thing. And by the time Yone was being made, again, like I think it's the interview is kind of funny because at the point the interview was made, Aurelia and Akali had already been made. And a lot of the other champions that I think are sort of like Yasuo derivative had already been proven out to be successful and to be functional, right? Silas as well, right? Like that are sort of sharing in some of the aspects of Yasuo's kit that were so effective to make it, like that led to Yasuo being such a wildly popular champion. Anyway, so this all started with the idea of Yone. Originally, EndlessPillows was talking about this Echo Fighter. I actually personally never played that version. I don't know if he ever implemented a version of that, at least not one that the game analysis team tested. Because for context, EndlessPillows is the designer that made Yone. I was the game analysis lead on Yone, and so myself, EndlessPillows, some of the artists and the narrative people were some of the people that worked most closely on Yone. And for me, it was basically an entire year of the bulk of my time being dedicated to working on Yone exclusively. So I have a lot of context, and like I said, I have a lot of sort of memories of the development process of Yone. And so this originally got spun up as a concept of what does Yasuo's dead brother look like in League? And so we started out with this version of Yone that punished dashes, because not only did Endless Pillows have this idea that maybe Yone really wants revenge on Yasuo, right? He did kill him after all. But maybe he really wants revenge. But also, from a gameplay perspective, one of the things a lot of people were concerned about, and one of the things that I think was really appealing for this pitch for some people, as an example, was, hey, one of the concerns with Yasuo being so popular was that Yasuo tends to make games about him, and he has a lot of sharp counters and sharp synergies. Like Malphite, for example, um, was very consistently like a top 10 popularity champion in a lot of regions like China and Vietnam, for example, during the time period when Yasuo was definitively the most popular champion in the game by a huge margin, partially because people would see Yasuo in their game. They say, "Oh, well, Malphite's good against Yasuo and good on Yasuo's team. I should pick Malphite, right?" And so the way that he was warping games we thought was kind of concerning in terms of game to game variance. Like, are too many games about Yasuo? And so one of the pitches that Endless Pillows had that I think a lot of people really attached to early on was, well, if Yone is a good counter to Yasuo and plays a little bit like him, people will be more afraid to blind pick Yasuo, because they'll get Yone slammed on them when that happens sometimes. And and if Yone is a good counter to him, then that might be really effective. And simultaneously, uh, this also means that some of the people who currently play Yasuo will move to Yone just generically, even if he is a good Yasuo counter, and then that will increase the game-to-game variance, because not every game will be about Yasuo, right? And so that was one of the pitches early on that I think was pretty interesting. The thing about this that they don't talk about really in the interviews, that like from my perspective on the game analysis side of things, that I think is worth mentioning, is that the version of the dash pursuing ability that that we tested for months, that was supposed to be I am an anti-dash champion, was actually far more effective against champions with a single dash than champions with a lot of dashes. I won't go into details because it seems like Endless Pillows didn't want to talk about the details, but basically it had some additional gameplay on the spell that made it such that if you had another dash to use, you could essentially dodge the damage that was associated with them following your dash. And champions that were extremely, extremely high-end mobility, like Yasuo, actually had an easier time dealing with the Yone following them than a champion like, say, like a Lucian, who has one dash. What would happen with the one dash is Lucian says, oh, I need to not interact with this Yone, I need to dash away from him. And then Yone would follow him and just start stabbing him and kill him instantly, right? And conversely, when you had a champion like a Riven or a Yasuo with a lot of dashes, what would happen is you would dash, the Yone would try to follow you, and then you would just dash again to avoid him following you, and then he would just you would keep doing that for a bit, and that would enable you to like space the Yone for a window of time as long as you had dashes. And that would often lead into you getting advantages on him, because like with the Yasuo case as an example, what would happen is Yasuo like ease to a minion in lane. If Yone would try to follow that dash to go behind the Yasuo would just say, okay, I'm going to Q you as you're doing that, and then I'm just going to dash to another minion, or vice versa, right? And which basically get free damage on the Yone while doing that. And so one of the problems I think we ran into with that version of the kit was that ostensibly it said I'm the anti-dash guy, but what it actually said is, number one, don't use your mobility, which is, one of the things that actually did happen, was that actually it resulted in everyone having less fun, because the actual counterplay was to just not use your dash spells a lot of the time. And so neither you nor Yone got to do anything cool. But also, it was way more effective against those champions like a Lucian or like a Tristana, or I don't know, what's another example, like someone who has one dash, like a Xin or something like that. Someone who has one dash was much, 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 much more impacted by Yone's ability to follow, because they wouldn't have another dash to dodge the Yone dashing on top of them to stall him out. And so I think that while that shape of the kit there were some really cool things about it. And one of the things they talk about towards the end of, I think, the third video, if you catch this, is the combination of the ultimate that we had on Yone for a really long time, which was basically self-Grog Assault, where you just knock everyone away from you. You would suspend everyone in the air for a little bit and then knock everyone away from you. With that spell, like follow dashes, That was incredibly cool. And that's the kind of pattern that I wouldn't be surprised if we tried on another champion in the future, where the figure out how to get into the enemy team and then you knock them all away from each other and you get to do this like anime like dash around everyone. It was extremely cool. Very, 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 very cool like kit fantasy and core hook, because part of what made it so cool to me was that it wasn't something that always happened, right? Sometimes you would just have to R one person and you just got to dash to them and it was like, okay, I guess my ult did a bit of damage, CC'd them a little bit, and let me dash. That was it, right? It was not a super exciting ult. But the moments where you got to ult like 4 or 5 people away from you and then do that crazy, like, I dashed to everyone that I just knocked away from me, like, you know, in sequence, that was so cool. And figuring out how you got in the center of the enemy team was actually kind of a challenge at times, because if they didn't dash, you didn't have a lot of mobility to work with on that version of Yone. And so that I think was like kind of a cool challenge to present to the player of like, how do you achieve this high moment? And then you get to have this really awesome high moment. It was a really compelling sort of kit hook. That E plus R combo was very cool on that early prototype of Yone, which again, if you watch the interviews, Endless Pillows talks a lot about this. We burned a lot of time on that, and we had to lock Yone super early because of all the cinematics and stuff that he was in. So they had to know how he was supposed to fight and how he was supposed to play. And so we wasted a lot of time on that for this kit that essentially just eventually just like we decided didn't work. Now, I think Yone was internally a pretty controversial champion. I think one of the biggest areas where I strongly disagreed with Endless Pillows, and still disagree to this day about this, is that the version of Yone that had 2 Yasuo Qs. This is something he had for quite a while in development, where you had your Q was Yasuo Q and your W was also Yasuo Q. They had some different properties where they would do some different things on the Q3, right? Like as an example, like one of the versions that we had in for a while was Q3. If you used the empowered version of Q3, you would do the dash forward and the wind slice that and the W3 was that but backwards, so you would like dash backwards and fire the wind slice in front of you. There were other versions that we tried, and there was even a version where pressing Q and W at the same time would make you stand in place and then fire the wind slash forward, which was kind of interesting. That was actually pretty cool as well. Just from like a tech perspective, I was kind of surprised that just like worked instantly when he put that in. But but ultimately, there were a lot of cool things we tried. The biggest area of disagreement, though, was the double Q, like the double Yasuo Q kit. And this was something where a lot of people like Endless Pillows and like Blau actually really liked it. And this is where I like myself and the rest of the game analysis team at the time really diverged, because we actually didn't think it was that fun. When we had most people playing it just found it to be kind of not that fun, even when it was wildly overpowered. And that was like alarm bells were ringing to me, because you can have actually really, really, really terrible gameplay in playtests a lot of the time. And if it's just really unfathomably overpowered, people will tell you they had a good time because they were winning, right? This is something we ran into, for example, with like Neferi. Neferi spent most of her development time wildly overpowered, which was really concerning to me when I came back to work on League. And I was like, yo, you've never seen this champ balanced or even weak? Like, are you sure that she's fun? It's very easy to cover up a lot of glaring flaws on kits about how they're actually going to play and whether they're going to be fun or not, if they're just crazy strong. And in fairness to Endless Pillows, he shipped a number of kits where they were overpowered for most of development. They still ended up being fun. For example, Pike was like this. But I think Yone, the Yone double Q kit was particularly concerning to myself and Gap, because you just spent so much of your time locked in animations. You would, you dash onto someone and then you have to spend all your time going auto Q W. And then by the time you're done with your W, your auto attack is back up again. And so you have to auto attack them. You don't get any time, any space to breathe. There's no time to do anything other than I have to execute constantly in fights. You had to constantly be executing in a way that even like Riven today isn't doing. At least with Riven, you do your Q cancels. It is a lot of button pressing. You got to, get your W, E, R, and R2 in there, right? You got to weave all of those. But then once you do all that stuff, it's like the combat resolves, right? It's over. With this Yone, especially with that older version of the E where you could basically, like, if anyone dashed, you could keep going. And especially with that R where it's like, well, if you can get into a group of people, you can fight all of them. There was no downtime. Anytime you were fighting someone in combat, it was like, I must be smash my button. And it actually required, because they're all, like, there were 2 skill shots and you have to auto attack, there's a lot of cursor precision required. Whereas, like, not just spamming a button like you do on Evelyn, for example, continuously, but spamming a button with high levels of precision, kind of like Zeri. But imagine if Zeri was melee and had 2 spells that were like her Q. That was really asking a lot of players, I think, and I don't actually think that when balanced, that kit would have been very fun. And even when it was wildly overpowered, most people who played it internally, right, outside of people like EndlessPillows and Blau, most people who played it on the game analysis team, and most people who played it even on the champions team at the time, didn't like the kit very much. Like they actually didn't want to have that high, like that uh I constantly press buttons while I'm in any kind of combat, and I also have to constantly be repositioning my cursor. Like that constant experience, we give people breathing room when we make these kinds of experience, right? Aurelia is a good example of this. Of Aurelia's W was intentionally designed to give both the person playing Aurelia and the person who is fighting Aurelia a clear window of time where Aurelia stops and does something, right? Same thing with like Fiora Parry to a lesser degree. Um, we kind of intentionally build out these moments of respite, and Yone couldn't be allowed to have those because of the way his kit was structured with the double Q or the double Yasuo Q. So that's just me noting that there was a lot of disagreement internally about whether 2 Yasuo Qs was a good idea, and of course we eventually ended up deciding that it was not, and we ended up shifting to the Yone E that which is the I detach from my body and like leave a marker that I have to go back to, or like depending how you frame it, basically LeBlanc W, but you can't, but you have to go back, right? Uh, so that's kind of how we ended up on that, and if talking about the ultimates that I talked about previously, where you got invulnerability or Tryndamere R or whatever, those were versions of the ultimate where when we were very briefly considering what if he just had Yasuo R like input paradigm of like teleport to a knocked up person, but he had a different output than suspending them and getting percent bonus penetration afterwards. And so the idea of these was like, oh, what if you just you just blink to them, they still drop to the ground in the same amount of time, but you get a buff, right? A different buff than the percent pen that Yasuo has. And so that was when we tested the like Tryndamere ult, the kill. Those versions of the champion were unfathomably overpowered. Certainly some of, if not the strongest things I've ever play tested with. They were completely insane. Um, but yeah, ultimately we moved to the version of the E, and of course the original version of the E, you could extend the duration of the Yone E, where attacks and Qs on champions would like extend the duration. But we found that both this was kind of weird for the Yone. You would sometimes be considering like, actually, do I even want to stay out? Like, should I reactivate early even though I've gotten all this extra duration? Is that right? And you would also find like you would also get into these situations where people would expect you to show up at your your body location, like your E pad, right? They'd be like, oh, well, the counterplay, like the visual language here is telling me that he's going to come back, and then he could often stay out for like 10-15 seconds if he was in a like continuous bit of combat, and it's like, oh, okay, so the counterplay, like the intended counterplay here, is kind of fake if he can extend the duration. So we ended up cutting the duration extension pretty early on, which I think was wise. I don't think I still have this clip, but I had this particularly funny clip from playtest of a base defense where I'm on red side, and I'm Yone, and I E. And I'm like defending my nexus, and we like push them off the nexus, and I'm able to keep extending the duration. I end up in mid lane, and a Shaco poofs on me and hits me for like I don't know, like, not 90% of my health, but like I get hit down to like 10% HP. The Shaco poofs on me as I'm like fighting other people, and I just say, take me back, and this is at a we were in a version of it where you couldn't reactivate the E, you just had to go at the end of the duration. And so I stop attacking people, and I really just hope the duration goes away before the Shaco gets another auto attack in and kills me, and it barely does, and I get flung all the way back to my fountain, where I E'd from, 30 seconds previously or whatever it was, I don't remember. And it was this completely ridiculous, like hilarious playtest moment. I should try and look and see if I actually have that clip anywhere. I don't think I do anymore, because unfortunately I lost a lot of my really old playtest clips when one of my old work PCs just got bricked. It was an unfortunate thing that happened, but I should look and see if I have it somewhere. I might have uploaded it to a drive or something. I don't know. Anyway, so In terms of other things, if you want to hear more about Yone's old kit, like I said, I recommend watching the videos, and I will put the links to them in the description of this video if you want to take a look at those interviews, because you can hear a lot about the old kit, and especially Endless Pillow's perspective, which I think is really interesting. But uh, ultimately, I'll sort of respect what Endless Pillows did and did not talk about, and not give you any super new, super different perspectives of like, unless there's anything I can think of right now that I don't think he would care if I talked about it, if I talked about it today. But nothing's really coming to my mind other than that. There was a version of Yone. This is actually something I don't know if it's ever been publicly talked about. There was a version of Yone where the W like cone slash that you know now was actually the Q2. And so it went Q1 was a normal Yasuo Q stab, and then Q2 was a cone sweep, like what you know now on the W. And then Q3 was the dash forward with the wind slice that you know. And so that was supposed to be one of the things that made him a little different from Yasuo, is that his Q1, 2, and 3 were all different instead of Q1 and Q2 being the same and Q3 being different. And that I found to be kind of an interesting paradigm. We ended up putting it on the W because we already had the animation, and we needed a W spell that felt really different to represent having another blade. And so that's that was actually done, by the way, by Repertoire, because there was actually a stretch of time for about a month, I think, where both Endless Pillows and Repertoire were working on the Yone kit because we were kind of behind time, and we needed to actually lock a good version of the kit down in order to make sure that the artists had enough lead time to make all the animations and VFX and all of that, and also to make sure that the people working on the like Kin of the Stained Blade cinematic and stuff like that had the the information that they needed around like how Yone fought and all of that. So we ended up moving that cone slash to the W, which I think worked okay, but I don't personally love the W spell. It's the kind of thing where I think if we went back, if I went back in time and I could advise Endless Pillows differently, if I were still in my same position as the lead analyst, I would definitely have given some very pointed feedback around how the W actually plays out, and like how it manifests in terms of like how you trade in lane and like how the champion actually plays. Because I think when optimized, the way that the W actually plays for Yone is like not super compelling. I think that's an area where maybe there could be some improvement at some point. I think we would probably do things differently. Well, I mean, I would definitely do things differently. I think Endless Blows would say the same thing. He would do things very differently if we went back and redid it. But yeah, anyway, at this point, I'm gonna cut this version of the video and I'm gonna hook this up to my original video that I made. So we'll start back up about the second row of Domination minor runes, and you can hook back up with my original version of the video. But yeah, hopefully you. Like this segment of me cutting in and redoing my answer to this Yone kit question, because I went and dug through my old stuff and was reminded of a lot of old Yone stuff that was around. Anyway, thanks, and see you in the next question. Let's move on. Okay, so this is another one. This is going to take some time to set up this discussion, but the second row of Domination minor runes. So let me talk about this. So this is an interesting one because this ties into a lot of the discussion that's had about like assassins in high skill and organized play, not just pro, just organized play in general. But the goal of the changes to the second drawer, right, replacing Zombie Ward, Ghost Poro, and Eyeball Collector with the current set, which is Sixth Sense, Grizzly Mementos, and Deep Ward. The idea was, hey, we can make the Domination keystones more powerful and replace this middle drawer with entirely vision-focused options, such that the power level of the Domination tree will be virtually identical for the average player in solo queue, right? Because that's how most players interact with the game. The thing is, assassins are much better in unorganized play than they are in organized play, right? And the most common example of organized play is pro play, right? And the goal of the Domination second drawer changes was to essentially keep the power level of the Domination tree identical for solo queue, but power up for organized play, because these champions that would be primary in Domination would have access to these powerful vision outputs. That's the goal. And I saw there was actually a comment in the thread here that this was in. It was like, well, it didn't work. Assassins aren't popular in pro. Right? Just because there aren't assassins in pro doesn't mean that this isn't power positive for assassins in pro, right? Imagine a world where, like, as an example, assassins are 10% off in pro. This could be a 5% buff. I don't think it is for what it's worth, right? But it's like the goal here was not that this was going to single-handedly leverage assassins into pro. The goal was that if we can find a number of places to do things like this, where we increase the relative power of assassins in organized play, and we do a number of these over the course of years, we can slowly make assassins more and more and more viable for organized play. And then maybe at some point we start seeing Kha'Zix in the jungle, who has some other outputs that are pro skewed, and then maybe we start seeing, I don't know, Zed in mid lane and in the right matchup for him or whatever, right? And that we can then, get that into a position that we're happy with, where we start seeing some of these champions in organized play that we'd be happy to see there. I think that likely this set of changes to the domination second tree or second minor row or second row. What am I saying? Second row was effective in increasing the power of domination primary in organized play, but in and of itself, of course, it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. There's no way that we could do that like on its own with just this this scale of change. The question is, can we find those other ways to make assassins more organized play friendly? And so far, I don't think we've really found any. We've taken a couple of stabs, at these kinds of effects, and never, found anything that seemed really effective. But maybe we can find them. Now, the other thing that I think is worth talking about is, does the second row of these runes feel bad to pick, right? Because it doesn't actually matter, even if you know consciously, I am similar in power level because my keystone is more powerful, right? And for those of you wondering, we did factually buff the keystones, right? The keystones in domination are more powerful than the keystones in other trees, because we know that this second drawer is not that powerful for most people if you're not in organized play. So we did buff them, right? Electrocute and Dark Harvest and Hail Blades all got buffs. Anyway, but the feeling of selecting a rune that you feel like is useless, that is bad. And I acknowledge that. And I think that is a downside of this tactic, is that you do feel bad about, well, I don't even care about this rune. I guess I'll take Mementos, or I guess I'll take Sixth Sense, and I don't care about this rune. It does nothing for me. Whereas at least when you clicked Eyeball Collector, you got to feel like, oh, well, at least I get some adaptive force out of this. Cool. That's great for me. And so I don't really have a great solution to this problem, right? Like, in my opinion, I don't think it was worth doing the changes to the second row, because I didn't think we were going to find other, small shifts that we could string together in such a way that we were going to see assassins in organized play. But I don't think that it was an unreasonable thing to try. But I do acknowledge this downside, I think, ends up being a little sharper than was originally intended around, hey, we knew that it would feel a little bad to select these, this middle drawer now, when it's something that you don't really care about as a random, solo queue, I don't know, like Kiana player or whatever, right? I think that we may have underestimated how bad that would feel. And so I'm not saying that we should, revert it or anything like that, or that we're gonna, we're likely to put any runes back in here that have combat power, because then we'd have to nerf the keystones and undo, basically everything here. But I do agree it's not an ideal state of things. Even if this work did probably move the needle a little bit, it just wasn't enough to be meaningful. And I personally think we're unlikely to find those other areas to bring up the power of assassins in organized play to actually make that this work function. And so my perspective is like, I don't think that this ended up panning out super well, but it's not a huge like on fire problem either. And so from that perspective, I say like, I don't know if we really need to solve anything here. All right. So I don't really like the way that this question is framed, but I'm going to read it out anyway because I think it's a fair topic to talk about, which is it a toxic idea to make and balance carry supports? And they're talking specifically about like mages, Senna, and whatever Keria is currently playing. So I'll briefly talk about the toxic ideas. Like, toxic doesn't really mean anything, right? Like when I say toxic, I typically am referring to like player behavior around like people are saying things. I don't really think there is such thing as a toxic design. I don't think it's a useful terminology because different people have very different opinions of what a toxic design is. So I'm not really going to talk about that part at all. What I'm going to sort of look at this question as saying is it a good or bad idea to have carry supports, or I'm going to talk about like carry supports in general. So my answer to this, as it is with a lot of things, is it depends, right? I think that carry supports, like supports that are actually doing the work that a carry would normally do can be okay given the right situation. I think older versions of Senna are a good example of this, right? Senna has largely turned to being more like an enchanter in recent days, that just happens to attack a lot. But I think older versions of Senna where she did a lot of damage and therefore like had different asks on your team comp, I actually think were totally reasonable, right? Now, there were reasons why that didn't end up working out. I think the big thing was just that Senna really wanted to lane with melee champions, and then that made her like extremely pro skewed because in solo queue, people would not be willing to play her with melee champions, and then therefore she became like very pro skewed because that was where people were willing to opt into that experience. But the idea of here is an intentionally designed support that is sort of acting as a carry with appropriate trade-offs. I don't think there's fundamentally anything wrong with that, as long as we have those appropriate trade-offs in play and it's clear what those are. As an example, when you have a Zyra or a brand support, I think it's pretty clear that there are some meaningful trade-offs being made in order to have a carry who is weaker than a real carry as your support, who can potentially like 1v2 lanes early and like be powerful and can do stuff in the later parts of the game. They are trading off on a lot of other things, right? There, your team doesn't have a Bandle Pipes, your team doesn't have Redemption, your team, loses out on a lot of these utility effects that you would otherwise have. You won't have frontline because you don't have a tank support, you don't have a locket, right? You're trading off on a lot of this stuff, right? Of things that you're not getting. And then these champions themselves are still not as strong as actual carry champions, right? Like a Zyra support is not as strong as a Zyra mid or a Zyra jungle would be because they just have less gold, right? And so my thought is, I don't think there's anything wrong with this as long as the trade-offs are apparent and as long as they are clear. I do think, for what it's worth, there have been cases in the past where those trade-offs haven't been as clear, right? Like particularly strong versions of Brand and Zyra support, for example, don't come with those trade-offs being as readily apparent, right? As an example of like when Brand support was at the peak of power, it wasn't really clear exactly what you were giving up to play Brand support. Like, well, Brand support, he's so not gold bound, the prior versions of him that were, very, very powerful as a support. And when he didn't have other better roles or other strong roles, I guess I should say, it wasn't really clear exactly like what was the downside of playing, of having a brand support as opposed to an enchanter. I think it was like, well, this guy is just like having all this crazy output. And he's not giving anything, like he's not really giving that much up because he's just, the full value of a carry in the support role. And so I think some of this comes down to balance and some of this comes down to kit shapes where I think there are some champions that probably shouldn't be allowed to be like 51% in the support role, as an example. And so fundamentally, I think this just comes down to a lot of case-by-case examples of, is there a clear trade-off when this champion is being played as a carry in the support role? And can we manage that in balance? Like via balance, I guess I should say. More so than is the idea fundamentally good or bad, if that makes sense. Okay, a couple questions about Asol. I'm going to knock these out quickly. So can Sol Q be allowed to stack Conqueror? So this is an interesting one because I think Aurelion Sol Q, actually, funnily enough, a lot of people ask about a lot of Conqueror special cases. I think Aurelion Sol Q, actually, compared to all of the other examples that people suggest or ask for that I've seen, actually matches up better with our rules for special casing, which is, if you look at the examples of our Conqueror special cases, which is like Garen E and Wukong are, it's spells that occur over a long duration, right? That replace your auto attack, which, guess what? Aurelion Sol Q does meet both of those criteria, right? It occurs over a long duration. It's theoretically infinite once you hit level 9. And simultaneously, it replaces your auto attack, right? You're not allowed to auto attack while you're Aurelion Sol Qing. Now, there are some barriers here, right? As an example, all of our other special cases are on melee champions, right? Which melees have an innate advantage to stacking Conqueror with their attacks. And so what we're replacing on Aurelion Sol is not the same as what we're replacing on Garen or Wukong, for example, right? Because Aurelion Sol auto-attacking people, sure, he'd keep his stacks up, but he would only be getting 1 stack per attack rather than 2, which is what Garen and Wukong would be getting. And so they're missing out on more than what Aurelion Sol is missing out on theoretically by disabling his auto-attack in order to queue. Now, I think from a systems perspective, this one seems kind of on the line, sort of in a gray area of, I think you could justify it from the perspective of what we've already done to Conqueror, but not clearly, oh, we should do it, or oh, we should definitely not do it, to me personally, as someone who does a lot of this kind of systemic work. Uh, but I think from a gameplay perspective, this is really interesting. It's another interesting question of, do we want Aurelion Sol to have access to Conqueror? Like, is that desirable or not? So there's some version, like some parts of this that I think are desirable. As an example, this supports a sustained DPS pattern, which is what we want Aurelion Sol to have, right? Other battle mages, like say Rise or Swain or Cassio, sometimes take Conquer, and I think it's good for them to support their sustained DPS pattern. It backloads their damage in a way that I think is very healthy for them. However, there is a danger, right? Asol already, and actually we'll get into this in the next question, has a lot of incentives on his kit to be very durable and not necessarily build lots of damage. And Conquer, one of the dangers of Conquer being accessible on your champion is that it gives you a lot of inherent damage that you don't have to build for, right? It gives you a lot of stats, right? Because it has to be able to match the power of all of the runes that it's competing with that give you immediate upfront power, right? There's lots of champions in the game that can trigger Electrocute in like a quarter of a second. And then most of the champions that can trigger Electrocute are triggering it in less than a second most of the time, right? And so Conqueror, which only gives you, the first second of combat, Conqueror is only going to be giving you like 1 to 2 damage worth of power a lot of the time, which is not much, right? And so Conqueror has to compete with that. All that power being backloaded means that Conqueror carries a lot more total power worth of like effective value in the situations where it's good. And so comparatively to something like Comet on Asol, Conqueror is a more total power keystone because it's asking you to be like asking for more situational or asking for a more narrow situation where it's useful, right? Like hitting someone with one burst of your Q in lane, Conqueror is just going to be bad, right? Whereas flying in on someone and playing like a team fight or something like that, Conqueror is of course going to be way better than something like Comet. And basically what I'm getting at here is the scary thing about allowing Aurelion Sol to access Conquer from a gameplay perspective is because it offers so much more power than other keystones, and it's power that offers specifically raw AP rather than a ratio in and of itself and like early game damage, is this would reward very high durability Aurelion Sol builds that don't go for higher damage items, which may then lead to us needing to buff AP ratios in ways that we might not actually want to on Aurelion Sol's kit in order to make sure that he's actually building an appropriate amount of damage and not just, hey, I take Conquer and then I build Rylai's Liandry's into tank items, right? I go, Rylai's Liandry's, Abyssal Mask, whatever, right? And that's kind of funny to think about because you might say like, oh, well, if you buff his AP ratios, doesn't that make Conquer even better? To some extent, yes, because it gives you AP, but to some extent, no, because Conquer is in support, like Conquer itself, because it asks for a very extended pattern, rewards you for being durable with AP. And so there's a lot of competing incentives here, but that's the scary part. And so my ultimate conclusion here is the answer to this question is like, maybe, but I'm not confident in either way because it seems like there's a lot of risks here. And it would be an exception that sort of meets the requirements of the other exceptions that we've made, but maybe not necessarily the letter of the rules in terms of, yeah, those exceptions we made on melee champions because their melee auto attacks are actually good at stacking Conqueror, whereas Aurelion Sol's ranged auto attacks are not. Then talking about his low AP ratios, just to answer the question, would I agree that Aurelion Sol has low AP ratios? Sort of, yes. I think this is a little bit awkward because so one of the ways that I judge AP ratios is what I call the doubling point. And you can thank my college roommate for this. You could call it the trench principle for my college roommate, Rusty Trench. Great guy. But he came up with this idea of like just using it as a quick benchmark to compare ratios of how much AP does it take to to essentially double the damage of your spell. It's a really quick and easy way to benchmark how an AP, like how good a ratio is comparatively to other kits or other spells on a kit. And it's interesting because if you look at some parts of Aurelion Sol's kit, like for example, his Q, like the DPS, right? Not the burst part, but the Q DPS, the doubling point is actually very low. It's about 200 AP. Whereas if you look at other parts of his kit, like the Q burst, the doubling point is actually very high, relatively speaking. And Aurelion Sol has a sort of wrench throwing into this comparison because he has damage on bursts that scales specifically with your stacks, which means that your stacks factor into the calculation as well for bursts and stuff, because they deal the max health damage based on your stacks. And so ultimately, my answer is like parts of Aurelion Sol's kit have very low AP ratios and parts don't. The damage that you actually deal with your breath that isn't the burst, like the damage per second part, that part ratio, like the ratio of that is very good. But the burst ratio is, I think, pretty poor. And that's mostly the power of that is largely driven by your stacks, which is part of why Aurelion Sol has these, high durability builds. And of course, the question then ends up being like, do we think this is correct? Should we have an AP ratio on that part of the burst? Should we have a better AP ratio on the ultimate? What about the E? There's all sorts of questions around like where should the ratios be distributed in Asol's kit and are they correct? My answer to this is I think that Aurelion Sol's current build is probably about right, where he feels good about buying items like Blackfire Torch, but he doesn't have to. Where he feels good about buying items like Rylai's and Leandries, but he doesn't necessarily have to have durability in every single slot. I do wish Death Cap was a little better. And so from that perspective, maybe there could be some better ratios on the kit. But he is the kind of champion that needs to have access to items that have durability on them, right? You have to either stand still or fly like in a specific direction where you're telling your opponents where you're going and where you are in order to deal damage to them, really, right? Like meaningful damage. And so my perspective is like, if anything, I think maybe the ratio on the Q bursts could be a little better. But I probably wouldn't want to increase the damage on his increase the ratio on his non-committal spells on E and R specifically, because I think those are spells that's scary to increase the ratios on, because there are spells where if he's building full damage, he doesn't actually have to expose himself to any risks at all in order to get effective value from those two spells. Whereas his Q is the spell kind of similar to like Swain Q or Rise Q, where it's like, well, you have to be pretty close to get power, like the value out of this, and you have to put yourself at some risk to use this spell and get the full value out of it. And so I think those kinds of spells having good AP ratios is generally a positive for me for battle mages, where, okay, look, if you build a death cap and you're able to stay near people and get your damage off, great. You know what? You did the thing. We should pay you. We should pay you out for that. Whereas Aurelion Sol, like E and R, are less committal spells, and so them having particularly great ratios, I think, doesn't really compel me that much from a kit shape perspective, or at least doesn't seem particularly great to me. Not saying that the exact ratios are like perfect or anything, but the general thought of improving those ratios doesn't seem super compelling to me from a perspective of what we want him to build. All right. Is there design space for a light cavalry type champion? I think the short answer to this is yes. If you go back and look at I think Quacks has a short about it of August talking about, and this is before my time, like a Yordle riding a griffin idea. I think this kind of like flying mount could work really well in League for a like lighter cavalry, like in and out type champion. And this is sort of what Kled was supposed to be, for what it's worth, right? Now, there are a lot of things about Kled that don't work. He's very weird, both from a thematic and from a gameplay perspective. And so I don't think that Kled's existence necessarily means that we can't have other mounted types of champions or like other types of mounted gameplay in the game, or like other types of cavalry champions in the game. Kled specifically is trying to get at the like mount remount fantasy, and he does some of that stuff pretty well. But I don't think that that necessarily means we couldn't have a smaller, like faster, lighter mounted type like in and out pattern. I think that's a totally reasonable thing that we could do given the right goals for a champion. I could see that working out. Moving on to, I'm curious why Riot didn't stick with Cassio's passive like they did with Feats and instead made her able to buy boots now. So this is a case where we found ourselves needing to, like, running into issues year after year where we had to, special case Cassio to interact with the system. And essentially we made the call to say, actually, it is just a core part of the game that you buy boots. And that's like, and that ties into our role quest system. That's just a part of the game. My perspective on this, I think, is a little different from other designers. I think other designers tend to get a little bit more frustrated with these kinds of systemic ties to things, and like are more strict and stringent on these kinds of systemic ties. I'm personally a bit more tolerant of these things. I personally think they're cool and worth preserving and spending the time to work on when they're like from time to time where we find that they're appropriately valuable. But other designers, I think, feel largely differently, where they feel pinned in and they feel like their systemic work being affected by like a way that a champion is constructed in the systems is too restrictive. And so they don't want to have these kinds of systemic ties. My personal take is I personally like it, right? I'll use Kaisa as an example. Kaisa is a champion that we have to do a lot of extra maintenance on whenever we change items because of her breakpoints for her evolves, right? And so that's a lot of additional work that we have to do, right? We've had to make a lot of changes to Kaisa over the years because of her systemic ties. But I think it's worth it, right? It's very cool for Kaisa. And sometimes we do make systemic changes and it's just okay for Kaisa. It's just fine. She just moves to a different build, or maybe the build's actually even better for her and we just have to do a late balance change to her or whatever, right? I think those kinds of systemic ties, a lot of it comes down to what degree is the system pinned because of the champion, or is the champion pinned because of the system? And with Cassio, we ended up deciding this is too extreme. And I think a lot of designers also felt like the passive itself wasn't that cool. I personally thought it was actually kind of interesting that you didn't have to buy boots, and that meant that your power curve and your shape over game time was a little different from other champions, and that gave you an extra slot. But one thing that I think is fair about the Cassio thing is that we're essentially giving the extra slot to 80 carries, and so that made it feel weird. It was like, oh, so Cassio sort of gets the bot lane quest when no matter where she's playing, and then what does she get when she's the bot lane quest? We don't even know. That's kind of weird. So that did feel off, and so from that perspective, I can definitely understand why the call was made. Like, let's just cut it. But I will say, from a personal perspective, I am very tolerant of these heavy-handed, like heavy system interactions on champions, more so than other designers that I think feel that these things are not worth maintaining. My personal opinion is just I just think these things can be cool enough that they can be worth it. But others feel differently. All right. So this was a very long post about pitching of like, oh, enchanters shouldn't be, heal bots. They should have, they should replace heal and shield power with AP. So I think there's a couple of immediate things that I really dislike about a pitch like this. And I think that, heal and shield power does do some things really well. So number one is differentiation between mage and enchanter builds, right? One of the big upsides that we get when we have heal and shield power, and that's different from AP, is that we can have a champion like Karma who builds full AP, and that will feel very different from a Karma who's building heal and shield power, right? And that's actually true for, like, we have a lot of champions that sort of exist at least a little bit in between the mage and enchanter space. And in fact, most of our enchanters have at least one, mage output, right? Like even Milio, who has 3 like hardcore enchanter outputs on his kit, has his Q, which is a mage, largely a mage spell, right? Enchanters aren't entirely distinct from mages as a class, really, right? Again, like I said, pretty much every enchanter has a mage output or 2 on their kit, sometimes even more than that, in the case of, say, Karma or Seraphine. And so one of the ways that we can actually make them feel more distinct, especially make their builds feel more distinct, is actually have stat differentiation at a baseline, which then therefore makes their spells feel different. That's one really big barrier to even considering something like this. And one of the reasons why I'd like immediately reject it and think like it's not even worth really thinking about much more. The other really big one to me is that the end result of doing something along this line of like, oh, enchanters have AP on their items rather than heal and shield power, is that the end result of that is that then all we have to do is we end up nerfing AP ratios on the enchanter damage spells. Because part of what makes this interesting is that when they do get AP, say Sona getting a Seraphs, for example, their kit plays a bit differently and they have a bit more damage. Whereas if all of their enchanter items are just giving AP, this means we just have to shift all of the power of their AP ratios into their enchanter outputs if we want that to be the thing that they're doing. And this means that these characters become much more one-dimensional. Even if in reality they don't actually build AP that often, these champions just become homogenized to their AP ratios all become homogenized to be on their shields. And we've muddied the difference between what exactly even is an enchanter and what is a mage, right? Because their class, the distinctions between the class in terms of their actual outputs are slightly fuzzy in some cases, like in something like Milio's Q, for example, right? Milio's Q gets to have a crazy AP ratio because building AP is not that good to scale Milio's shields and heals, right? And that can be fun for some people to buy an AP item first, even if it's not that optimal, right? And Milio's kit's maybe not the best example because he doesn't have enough mage outputs for us to actually load, meaningful power there, right? Don't get me wrong. Um, uh, the Oh, sorry, I just got distracted by something on Discord. Sorry about that. But yeah, to sort of sum up my my thoughts on the matter is like I do not think that this pitch makes sense fundamentally because it has these two sort of significant issues around washing out the differences between the classes. I guess it's sort of more than two. Washing out the differences between the classes, washing out the differences between builds, and the end result being actually this just means that the enchanters and enchanter adjacent champions or like mage adjacent enchanters aren't allowed to have good AP ratios on their damage, right? That's the end result of any pitch in this direction, and so I don't really find this to be compelling. All right. Add an AP scaling on Yorick's Maiden. This was kind of an interesting thought to me because I think the scary thing about this is that we know that there are AP items we don't want to be accessible for Yorick, specifically Rylai's, right? And partially that's because the Maiden and Ghouls apply spell effects, and we've seen that world before with Cyrilda's Grudge, where if a Ghoul or the Maiden is perma-slowing you, the gameplay there is pretty poor. But I think the idea of restructuring Yorick's kit a little bit and allowing him to have an AP off build is not crazy to me. But I think that probably involves the Ghouls and the Maiden probably not applying spell effects as probably a bare minimum, because as long as they apply spell effects, I think the idea of adding any AP ratios to Yorick's kit I'm really extremely skeptical of that, because anything that makes AP functional at all on Yorick, or maybe not functional is not the right word, but anything that makes AP meaningfully more powerful on Yorick is like, we've already seen versions of Yorick with his current AP ratios where he builds Liandry's, right? And so he's pretty clearly much closer to that than you might expect. And so my perspective is I look at this and I say, not in any world where the Ghouls and the Maiden apply spell effects, and then therefore they have access to things like Liandry's and Rylai's, because I don't think we actually want Yorick to be a systemic carrier for the AP item system. And so meaningful AP ratios, I think, seem pretty unlikely to me to be something that we would want to add to Yorick, unless we wanted to do more work on his kit and divorce him from spell effects, which is a whole different topic of conversation, which I think is pretty reasonable to do. But that's not what we're talking about here. Camille thing. I talked about Camille in the previous one, number 8, right? But anyway, this is related to a Kale question I think I have of like scaling past 18. I personally am not a fan of the idea of specifically making things scale past level 18. For one, we don't even necessarily know if the top lane quest is going to stick around forever in League, right? Or that it'll always be level 20. And so building specifically out to play around a top quest, which, hey, maybe people will decide that they actually really like playing Camille mid in the future, and that's where we'll want to, have her primary role be, and then we'd have this weird, outcropping of level 20 scaling. And so I'm not compelled by this idea at all, really. From fundamental, like, hey, let's make her scale past level 18 because we want her to scale. I do think that the idea of Camille needs too many items to feel good, that I tend to agree with. I think that that's fair. I think that Camille could be more functional on 2 items. But to me, that doesn't necessarily come at all attached to scaling past level 18. And to me, that just comes around, hey, what kinds of items is she buying? What stats are she getting from those items? Are those stats enough for her to feel good about her build structure and like the damage that her Q is doing and so on and so forth, right? So ultimately, my answer to this is, I understand the underlying problem, and I agree that it is something that doesn't feel great. This exact solution, I do not think is a particularly compelling way of going about addressing the core issue here. All right. So does anyone else feel that there isn't enough headroom for crit items? Talking about overcapping crit, feeling forced to buy non-crit items, like particularly noting that LDR and Mortal Reminder are crit items now, and they weren't before in older systems, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something that we've talked about, and I have actually tested, like for Season 16, I tested versions of the crit system where some items had 50% crit, and you could overcap and get value from that. Like I had a conversion effect on IE. There was interesting things about that. And I think this is something that we will probably continue to talk about, especially in the context of the 80 carry quest giving you access to an extra item slot. Because in the original version of this design structure of the 80 carry crit system, the idea was, oh, it's really cool if you get to pick one non-crit item, right? It'll be either a first item and you build it as like a really powerful spike and you delay your scaling a little bit. This was like Kraken's Lair, and the original goal was Bork as well, but obviously that hasn't really panned out very well. Or later you get a BT or you get a GA, and those are cool items that you can buy, and you feel good about having a one-off exception. But I do think in the current system where there's 2 slots for that, it feels a bit different. And even though you don't actually get to 6 items most games as an 80 carry, I think the feeling of optimizing your full build is still very different. And it's something that I think we should spend some time talking about, thinking about, in terms of, do we think that this is structurally correct? Do we think we have the right number of non-crit items that feel good for 80 carries, right? And I'm not sure the answer is yes or no. Like from a personal perspective, I'm not sure. I think it's an interesting line of reasoning. It's an interesting discussion to have, but I don't have a solid answer of like, oh, it should be A or it should be B or we should do X, Y, or Z. It's a topic of discussion. I think it's something we should talk about in the context of the 80 carry quest, or the bot lane carry quest, I guess is technically what it is. But definitely heard on this one. I definitely agree that this is something that feels a little off when you're building some 80 carries, especially. I think some don't feel so bad about it, right? It's like you're playing Smolder, for example. It's like, oh, awesome. I have lots of builds that get 100% crit where I feel great about my 2 non-crit items. And I have lots of builds that feel good about going 75 or even 50% crit on Smolder, right? As an example. But more mainline crit champions, like say a Caitlyn or a Jinx, for example, I do feel like this effect does manifest of this feels a little off. So definitely understood there. All right. More AP omnivamp items. I think the space for this is a lot smaller than people would expect. This is something that I've tested a number of these before, and I think that this is something that people claim that they want, and a lot of people think back to like the old Spirit of the Spectral Wraith or the old Woda even, and they're like, oh yeah, those items were so cool. Forgetting that those items really were only good in the context of a lot of the kits that were in the game back then that actually needed Vamp to function, right? The old Vlad and the old Mordekaiser, for example, had very high health costs that were compensated for the fact that you could buy Vamp that would, overcome those health costs, right? And in general, I suspect that while I think there is space for maybe a baseline AP Vamp item, very few champions are actually willing to pay the cost of Omnivamp in the AP system, right? This is why when I made Riftmaker, I made the Vamp a bonus effect that happens when you get maximum stacks, and it's not baseline on the item. Because if I put it baseline on the item, it actually would have restricted, like locked out a lot of the intended users who wouldn't actually be willing to pay the cost of that Omnivamp being baseline on the item, which is very powerful, right? And so this is a case where I think there is maybe space for one of these items that is very battle mage shaped and maybe accessible for some of our fightery melee champions. But I think it'll be a lot less broad than you might imagine, because Omnivamp, like Vamp effects on items cost a lot for these types of champions. And most champions aren't willing to pay the appropriate cost. And if we undercost it so that those champions can buy it, then we have to just nuke the champions that actually can access that effect at full efficiency, right? This is like the Gwens of the world, for example. And so, structurally speaking, I think there's a lot of dangers in these kinds of items, especially, and I've talked about this a lot, I personally am very skeptical of early slot powerful Vamp items, because that tends to break a lot of laning phase patterns where, hey, I'm playing like Xerath versus Akali, right, is a good example from the current game. And Xerath's obviously not the greatest example because how many people are really playing Xerath mid. I'm playing Lux versus Akali, for example. If my goal is to get the Akali chipped out enough that I can kill her with one combo if she tries to all in me, when Akali buys Gunblade, she no longer is actually chippable, right? Like I can't actually chip her out to get her in range for my combo, and therefore I actually don't have a win condition in this lane. Besides, I hope this Akali dives me and I can kill her with, multiple tower shots while she's rooted or something like that. And so that kind of pattern, or that like early powerful vamp can definitely break some patterns, like some laning patterns on first item. So if we did want to make these AP omnivamp items, I suspect it would probably be something that looks a lot more similar to Endless Hunger. That is clearly an item that you don't want in your first slot. But is it impossible? No. But I personally don't think that there's a crazy value here because there's not actually that many champions in the AP system that desperately need this effect or are really heavily actually like pursuing looking for this effect or feel like it's missing from their kits, from my perspective. Not to say that there aren't some, but I don't think there's actually that many. All right. Same as before, we're actually over an hour, but I'll do one more bonus question and then call this video and upload it tomorrow, I guess. So, how much of game design / balance is rooted in player preference? They shouldn't be an X lane / like this isn't what I signed up for. The answer is some. It depends on what kind of system you're talking about here, where some of this champion shows up in the lane and people do not like the typical players of that lane really don't appreciate the types of things that they're doing. Some of that affects it, right? Like as an example, there were lots of versions of ranged top laners that were factually balanced before we made this version of Doran's Shield and this Second Wind. But we made Doran's Shield and Second Wind because we knew that it was an extremely painful experience playing into ranged top laners as a melee, especially melees that don't have good tools to deal with those, like that just get pummeled over and over and over again. And so we made these very powerful regen effects to say, hey, look, you're going to get pummeled, but at least you have something that'll let you farm and keep you in the lane. And that, there were plenty of versions of Jace in season 4 that was a factually balanced top laner, right? But we think it's a better state of the game when we have powerful systemic outputs that reduce the pain of laning against those kinds of things, right? And so some of this, I think a lot of this question was targeted at like removal of things. I think of this more in the space of us shaping the game to make those experiences that are painful less painful where we can. And obviously there are cases where we remove stuff, right? I'm trying to think of a great example off the top of my head. I'm not coming up with one immediately, but I don't know, something like what's something we've removed, for player? Oh, original Nidalee, for example, right? It's like, yeah, it's really painful to have this champion just sit slightly out of your interaction range and throw spears at you until one of them hits and it deals 90% of your health. It's a really kind of horrible gameplay experience, right? Particularly because if you ever did get to interact with her, well, guess what? She has a dash, a free target dash she can use directly away from you, right? This is one of the key differences with Zoe, for example, is that Zoe has to put herself on your screen, actually in your interaction range to do these things to you. And if you go towards her, she doesn't have a spell, like an effect that it like lets her immediately escape from you. If you catch Zoe, even in some cases, if you stun her when she R's forward, you can catch up to her on her pad where she goes back and kill her, right? And that's one of the key things that makes Zoe very different from the original Nidalee spears, right? And so some things are too extreme or we can't build systemic counterplay to them, but some game design is rooted here, right? Like it's a non-zero amount. But I don't know of a good metric for saying like how much of it is this because I don't really know how to quantify what a unit of game design or balance is, right? Like I don't know how to say that. Whereas like I would say for balance is like what percentage of the live pod's time is spent dealing with these kinds of issues? Not that much, probably less than 5%, right? I would say because most of the live pod's time is just doing balance, like patch to patch balance issues, which are largely factually, is this champion too strong? Is this champion too weak? Do we want this champion to be stronger? Do we want this champion to be weaker? They do deal with, is this champion too frustrating from time to time? But that's not most of their work. Conversely, like on the seasonal pod, what percentage of our like time is spent addressing these kinds of issues? Probably more than 5%, but not a crazy percentage, maybe like 10, 15%, I would guess, right? Like we address these systemically as an example, like, hey, as an example of this isn't what I signed up for, the entire reason we made turret plates was because laning phases were ending super early and people felt like they couldn't actually experience their lane. Like we felt that players couldn't actually play out their like lane fantasy and like lane gameplay in the way that we wanted, or that the way that players wanted. And so therefore we created plates to extend the laning phase. And the catchphrase at the time was "laning phase is sacred," which not a very good catchphrase looking back, but it was what we were saying back then. And so sometimes we do entire systems to make sure that the game plays the way that people want it to play. But it's not all of the reason why we do all these changes. And so the ultimate answer to the question is some, but not all. And it depends on what kind of work you're talking about, how much of design or balance is rooted here. So ultimately, hopefully that's a compelling answer. And like I said, thank you for watching. Or not like I said. Why did I say it like that? Anyway, so this will wrap up number 9. Thank you for watching. I'll probably put this video up tomorrow. And still got plenty of questions to get through, so might need to do a few more double headers recordings in the future, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, thanks for watching, and catch you next time.